Your hair is a distraction and violates our dress code policy. But this is how I always wear it. It's not fair.
The school board meeting room was packed wall to wall with community members, parents, students, and local media. The air was thick with tension as Mrs. Patricia Thornton stood before the board, her hands trembling slightly, her face drained of color. This 28-year teaching veteran, known for her composed demeanor and unwavering authority, looked visibly shaken. Her voice cracked as she spoke into the microphone. "I demand a formal investigation into discrimination at Riverside Academy. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back 3 weeks earlier, to a moment that would change everything." It was the first day back from winter break, and students were filing into Mrs. Thornton's English literature classroom at Riverside Academy. Among them was 14-year-old Amara Williams, a bright-eyed black girl with beautifully intricate box braids that cascaded down her shoulders. The braids were adorned with traditional golden and amber beads that caught the light with every movement, creating a soft, melodic clicking sound. Amara walked in with quiet confidence, her books held close to her chest, completely unaware of the storm that was about to erupt. Mrs. Thornton's face tightened the moment she saw those braids. Her jaw clenched. Her eyes narrowed. In the middle of explaining the day's lesson on classic literature, she stopped mid-sentence. 28 students fell silent as their teacher's attention fixed on one person. "Miss Williams," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the classroom like a blade. "Come to the front of the class. Now." Amara's heart jumped. Confused, she slowly stood up, her braids swaying gently, the beads creating that soft clicking sound that suddenly felt deafening in the silent room. Every pair of eyes was on her as she walked to the front. "Miss Williams," Mrs. Thornton said, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, "your hairstyle is inappropriate for this learning environment." The words hung in the air like poison. Amara blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" she stammered. Mrs. Thornton gestured dismissively at Amara's head. "That," she said with barely concealed disgust, "is a distraction and violates our dress code policy." Amara's face burned with humiliation. In front of all her classmates, in front of everyone, her teacher was attacking her hair. Her hands instinctively reached up to touch her braids protectively. "Mrs. Thornton," she said, her voice shaking but trying to remain respectful, "these are box braids. It's a protective hairstyle. It's also culturally significant to my heritage." She tried to explain, tried to make her teacher understand, but Mrs. Thornton's expression remained stone cold. "I don't care what it is at home, Miss Williams," the teacher replied icily. "Here at Riverside Academy we follow school policy. Remove those decorations by tomorrow, or there will be consequences." The classroom erupted in whispers. Some students looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Others stared at Amara with pity. Her best friend Maya, a Latina girl sitting in the third row, looked absolutely furious, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. Amara stood there for what felt like an eternity, her hands shaking, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. The beads in her braids clicked softly as she finally turned and walked back to her seat, her head down, her heart shattered. But who was Amara Williams, and why did her hair mean so much more than just a hairstyle? That morning, just hours before this humiliation, Amara had woken up in the small but warm home she shared with her grandmother in a modest neighborhood just outside the city. At 14 years old, Amara was exceptional in every way. She was at the top of her class academically, maintaining a perfect 4.0 grade average. She was the president of the debate team, known for her sharp intellect and her ability to articulate complex arguments with grace and precision. But more than anything, Amara had a dream that burned bright inside her heart. She wanted to become a civil rights attorney, to fight for justice, to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. That morning, her grandmother Ao had sat behind her in their small living room, her aged but skilled fingers working through Amara's thick, beautiful hair. Ao had immigrated from Nigeria decades ago, bringing with her the traditions, the stories, and the cultural practices of her homeland. As she carefully maintained Amara's box braids, adding the golden and amber beads with practiced precision, she hummed an old Nigerian lullaby, the same one Amara's mother used to sing. Amara's mother. The thought of her brought that familiar ache to Amara's chest. 2 years ago, her mother had passed away after a sudden illness, leaving a void in Amara's life that seemed impossible to fill. But these braids, these beautiful, intricate braids adorned with beads, were Amara's connection to her. Her mother used to braid her hair every Sunday evening, telling her stories about their ancestors, about strong African women who wore their hair as crowns, about the history woven into every strand. Now, Grandmother Ao had taken on that sacred role, and every time she touched Amara's hair, It was like her mother's hands were there too. There, Ao said softly that morning, her Nigerian accent still thick despite her years in America. Beautiful, my dear. Just like your mother. Amara looked at herself in the mirror, touching the beads gently, feeling the weight of heritage, of love, of memory. She smiled, though sadness flickered in her eyes. Thank you, Grandma, she whispered. These braids weren't just a hairstyle. They were her identity. They were her history. They were her mother's legacy. As Amara grabbed her backpack and headed toward the door, her best friend Maya was already waiting outside, leaning against the fence with her own backpack slung over one shoulder. Maya and Amara had been inseparable since 6th grade, two girls from different backgrounds who'd found in each other a fierce, loyal friendship. Looking gorgeous as always, Maya called out with a grin as Amara walked down the front steps. They walked together toward Riverside Academy, talking about winter break, about the upcoming debate competition, about everything and nothing, completely unaware that this day would change everything. Meanwhile, across town, Mrs. Patricia Thornton was preparing for her day with the same meticulous precision she'd maintained for 28 years. Patricia Thornton was a fixture at Riverside Academy. She'd been teaching English literature there since she was in her 20s, and now, approaching her mid-50s, the school had become her entire world. She lived alone in a small, immaculately kept apartment, every book on her shelf organized alphabetically, every surface dust-free, every aspect of her life controlled and orderly. Patricia prided herself on maintaining standards, discipline, tradition, excellence. These weren't just words to her, they were a philosophy, a way of life. She believed that structure created success, that rules existed for a reason, that when you allowed disorder, chaos followed. She prepared her lesson plans weeks in advance, graded papers with exacting precision, and expected nothing less than absolute compliance from her students. Her reputation at Riverside was formidable. Students respected her, feared her even, but they knew that in her classroom, excellence was the only option. As she stood in front of her bathroom mirror that morning, adjusting her conservative blouse and making sure every hair was in place, she glanced at a framed photograph sitting on her dresser. It was old, taken perhaps 20 years ago, showing a younger Patricia standing beside a black woman, both of them smiling genuinely, arms around each other's shoulders. The woman in the photo was Diane Morris, a fellow teacher who had once been Patricia's closest friend. But that was a long time ago. Before Diane left Riverside under circumstances Patricia rarely allowed herself to think about. She pushed the thought away as she always did and focused on the day ahead. At Riverside Academy, Principal George Hartford was already in his office, reviewing enrollment numbers and budget reports. Hartford was 58 years old, a career administrator who dedicated his entire professional life to the school. He was traditional, old school in his methods, and just 2 years away from retirement. More importantly, he'd been Patricia Thornton's mentor for 15 years, guiding her career, supporting her methods, trusting her judgment. To Hartford, Patricia represented everything a teacher should be: dedicated, disciplined, unwavering in her commitment to academic excellence. Patricia arrived at school that morning with her usual routine, unlocking her classroom door, arranging her materials on the desk with precision, writing the day's objectives on the board in her neat, careful handwriting. Everything had to be proper. Everything had to be perfect. That's how she maintained control. That's how she ensured her students learned. She didn't yet know that in just a few hours her entire world would begin to crumble. When Amara walked into that classroom, braids adorned with those beautiful golden and amber beads, something inside Patricia Thornton reacted viscerally. She saw it as disorder, as a challenge to the standards she'd spent decades maintaining, as something that didn't belong in her carefully controlled environment. She didn't see heritage. She didn't see culture. She didn't see a young girl honoring her mother's memory. She saw a violation and she responded the only way she knew how, with authority, with discipline, with an iron hand. After Mrs. Thornton dismissed her back to her seat with those humiliating words still hanging in the air, Amara somehow made it through the rest of the class period. But the moment the bell rang, she grabbed her things and rushed out, her vision blurred with tears she'd been holding back for 45 agonizing minutes. She practically ran to the nearest bathroom, bursting through the door and gripping the sink, finally letting the tears flow. The beads in her braids clicked against the porcelain as she bent her head, shoulders shaking. Maya burst in seconds later, having followed her friend. "Amara," she said urgently, rushing to her side and putting an arm around her shoulders. Amara looked up at her reflection in the mirror, mascara running down her cheeks, her hands protectively touching her braids. "She humiliated me in front of everyone, Maya," Amara choked out. "She called my hair a distraction. She called the beads decorations like they're just some accessory I can take off. Her fingers ran over the smooth surface of the golden beads, the ones her grandmother had so carefully placed that very morning. My mom used to put these in my hair. This is part of who I am. Maya's face was set with determination. You need to report this, Amara. You need to go to the principal, to someone. This is discrimination. This is wrong. But Amara hesitated, shaking her head. I don't want to cause trouble, she said quietly. I don't want to be that student who makes a big deal out of everything. Maybe I should just. She trailed off, but Maya cut her off immediately. Don't you dare finish that sentence. Don't you dare say you should change who you are because some teacher has a problem with your culture. That afternoon, when Amara walked through the front door of her home, Grandmother Ao took one look at her granddaughter's face and knew something was terribly wrong. Amara collapsed onto the couch and told her everything, every humiliating detail, every word Mrs. Thornton had said. As she spoke, Ao's expression transformed from concern to something much deeper, a quiet, simmering anger that seemed to age her face even further. When Amara finished, there was a long silence. Then Ao reached out and gently touched her granddaughter's braids, her fingers tracing the beads with reverence. Your hair tells our story, Amara, she said, her voice low but fierce. You will not erase it. Not for anyone. Ao stood up, her small frame somehow seeming larger, more powerful. She began to speak, her Nigerian accent growing stronger with emotion. Do you know the history of these braids? Do you know what they meant to our people? Amara shook her head and Ao sat back down, taking her granddaughter's hands in hers. During slavery, our ancestors used braids as maps to freedom. They would create patterns that showed escape routes, that held information, that preserved our culture when everything else was being stripped away. Braids were resistance. Braids were survival. Braids were memory. Her eyes glistened with tears. Your mother understood this. Every time she braided your hair, she was connecting you to generations of strong African women who refused to be erased. Ao's voice grew even more passionate. When we were brought to this country in chains, they tried to take everything from us. Our names, our language, our religion, our culture. But our hair, our beautiful African hair, that was something they couldn't fully control. So we braided it. We adorned it. We made it beautiful as an act of defiance, as a declaration that we were still human, still worthy, still connected to our homeland. She squeezed Amara's hands tighter. These beads you wear, they're not decorations. They're symbols of identity, of heritage, of pride. And no one has the right to tell you to remove them. Amara listened, feeling something shift inside her. The shame and humiliation from earlier began to transform into something else, something stronger. So what do I do, Grandma? She asked. Ao smiled, a sad but determined smile. You go back to that school tomorrow with your head held high and your braids exactly as they are. You show them that you cannot be erased. You show them that your culture is not something to be ashamed of or hidden away. That night, Amara stood in front of her bedroom mirror for a long time. She touched her braids, feeling the texture, hearing the soft click of the beads. She thought about her mother, about all the Sunday evenings spent between her legs as gentle hands wove intricate patterns into her hair. She thought about her ancestors, about women who'd worn these same styles as acts of resistance and survival. She thought about who she was, who she wanted to be, and what she was willing to fight for. In that moment, Amara Williams made a decision. She would not remove her braids. She would not take out the beads. She would not make herself smaller to fit into someone else's narrow definition of acceptable. Tomorrow she would walk back into Riverside Academy exactly as she was, and whatever consequences came, she would face them with dignity. As she climbed into bed that night, her braids spread across her pillow like a crown, Amara felt afraid but also strangely empowered. She didn't know it yet, but this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just her own life, but an entire community. If you want to see what happens when Amara returns to school and stands her ground, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now because this story is about to get even more intense. And here's a question for you. Have you or someone you know ever been discriminated against because of your culture or appearance? Drop your answer in the comments below, because your stories matter, and this conversation is just beginning. The next morning, Amara Williams walked through the front doors of Riverside Academy with her braids still perfectly intact, the golden and amber beads catching the morning sunlight streaming through the hallway windows. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, "You will not erase yourself for anyone." She held her head high, her books clutched against her chest, and began the long walk down the main corridor toward her first period class. The whispers started immediately. Students turned to look at her as she passed, their voices creating a low buzz that followed her like a shadow. Some of the whispers were supportive, students nodding at her with respect, a few even giving her small smiles of encouragement. A girl from her debate team touched her arm gently and whispered, "Good for you." But others stared with curiosity, confusion, or judgment, their eyes following her braids, watching the beads sway with each step she took. Amara could feel every single gaze, every whisper seemed to press against her skin, but she kept walking, kept her breathing steady, kept moving forward. Maya was waiting by her locker, and when she saw Amara, her face broke into a fierce grin. "That's my girl," she said proudly, falling into step beside her best friend. "You ready for this?" Amara took a deep breath. "No," she admitted honestly. "But I'm doing it anyway." Together they walked toward Mrs. Thornton's English literature classroom, and with every step, Amara felt the weight of what she was about to do. She wasn't just walking into a classroom. She was making a stand. When Amara entered the room, the effect was immediate. Mrs. Thornton was mid-sentence, explaining something about symbolism in classic literature, when she looked up and saw Amara walk through the door. The teacher's face hardened instantly, her jaw clenching, her eyes narrowing. The words she'd been speaking died on her lips. The entire classroom went silent. 28 students watched as their teacher and their classmate locked eyes in a silent battle of wills. Amara walked to her usual seat, her braids swaying, the beads creating that soft, musical clicking sound that now seemed to echo in the deafening silence. Mrs. Thornton's hand gripped the edge of her desk so tightly her knuckles turned white. She took a breath, composing herself, and then spoke in a voice that was cold and sharp as ice. "Miss Williams," she said, each word precisely enunciated, "I gave you clear instructions yesterday." Amara slowly stood up beside her desk. Her hands were shaking, but when she spoke, her voice was steady, stronger than she felt inside. "Mrs. Thornton," she said, looking her teacher directly in the eye, "I went home last night and I researched the Riverside Academy dress code policy. I read it cover to cover. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, in that policy about hairstyles." The classroom collectively held its breath. No one had ever challenged Mrs. Thornton like this. No one had ever stood up to her with such quiet defiance. The teacher's face flushed red, a mixture of anger and something else, something like shock that a student would dare question her authority so directly. "Don't be insolent with me, Miss Williams," Mrs. Thornton said, her voice rising slightly. She pointed toward the door. "Report to Principal Hartford's office immediately." Amara felt her stomach drop, but she didn't let it show on her face. She gathered her books slowly, deliberately, refusing to rush, refusing to look ashamed. The beads in her braids clinked softly against each other as she moved. As she walked toward the classroom door, something unexpected happened. Maya suddenly stood up from her desk, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This isn't right," Maya said, her voice ringing out clearly in the silent classroom. "This is discrimination and everyone in this room knows it." Mrs. Thornton's head snapped toward Maya, her eyes blazing. "Sit down, Miss Rodriguez," she commanded, her voice like steel, "unless you'd like to join her." Maya hesitated for just a moment, her eyes meeting Amara's, 1,000 words passing between them in that single glance. Then she slowly sat back down, but the defiance in her expression remained. Amara walked out of that classroom with her head high, but the moment the door closed behind her, her hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The walk to Principal Hartford's office felt like the longest journey of her life. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, and with each step, the beads in her braids created a rhythm that somehow kept her moving forward. When she reached the administrative office, the secretary looked up with sympathy in her eyes and simply nodded toward the principal's door. Amara knocked, heard a gruff, "Come in," and entered. Principal George Hartford was 58 years old, a man who'd spent his entire career at Riverside Academy and was now just 2 years away from a comfortable retirement. He was old school in every sense of the word, a man who believed in hierarchy, in authority, in the way things had always been done. When Amara entered his office, he was sitting behind his large oak desk, and she could see immediately that he was uncomfortable with this entire situation. He gestured for her to sit down, and she did, perching on the edge of the chair, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Hartford sighed, a long weary sound, and rubbed his temples. "Amara," he began, his voice attempting to sound fatherly but coming across as patronizing, "I understand that Mrs. Thornton spoke to you about your hair yesterday." Amara nodded. "She did, sir." Hartford leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're a good student, Amara. Excellent grades, president of the debate team, never been in trouble before. I'd hate to see this become a bigger issue than it needs to be. He paused, choosing his words carefully. What if we found a compromise? Maybe you could wear your braids in a simpler style without the beads? Something a bit more understated? Amara felt anger flare in her chest, but she kept her voice respectful and measured, the same tone she used in debate competitions when she needed to make a powerful argument without losing her composure. With respect, Principal Hartford, this isn't about being understated. These braids, these beads, they're part of my cultural expression. They're part of my Nigerian heritage. Asking me to remove them isn't a compromise, it's asking me to hide who I am. Hartford shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I understand that you feel strongly about this, but we have standards at this school. Amara interrupted, something she never would have done under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances. What standard does my hair violate, sir? I've read the dress code policy. There's nothing in it about hairstyles or cultural expression. Hartford's discomfort grew more visible. He hadn't expected this level of articulate pushback from a 14-year-old. Amara, he said, his voice taking on a firmer tone, I'm going to need to call your guardian. School policy requires a parent or guardian present for disciplinary discussions involving students under 16. He picked up the phone and dialed the number from Amara's file. Within 30 minutes, Grandmother Ao arrived at the school, and the moment she walked into Principal Hartford's office, the entire energy of the room shifted. Ao was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she carried herself with a commanding presence that seemed to fill the space. She was wearing traditional Nigerian attire, a beautiful wrapper and head wrap in vibrant colors, and she walked in with the dignity of a queen entering her throne room. Mrs. Okonkwo, Hartford said, standing up and extending his hand. Ao shook it briefly, her expression serious, and immediately moved to stand beside her granddaughter, placing a protective hand on Amara's shoulder. Thank you for coming in. We're having a discussion about Amara's hairstyle and, Ao cut him off, her Nigerian accent thick with emotion. My granddaughter's hairstyle? You called me out of my work to discuss my granddaughter's hair? Hartford cleared his throat. Mrs. Okonkwo, we have certain standards at Riverside Academy, and we believe that Amara's current hairstyle, while I'm sure culturally meaningful, is creating a distraction in the classroom. Ao's eyes narrowed. A distraction? Her hair is a distraction. She has worn braids her entire life. She has attended this school for 2 years with braids. Suddenly now it is a problem? The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Hartford tried to maintain his administrative authority. We're simply asking for some flexibility, perhaps a simpler style. You are asking my granddaughter to erase her culture, Ao interrupted, her voice rising. You are asking her to be ashamed of her heritage. Tell me, Principal Hartford, what is this policy you speak of? Show me in your handbook where it says African hairstyles are forbidden. Hartford fumbled with papers on his desk, clearly flustered. It's not specifically stated, but we have a general clause about appropriate appearance. Ao leaned forward. General clause? So this is subjective? Based on whose idea of appropriate? Yours? Mrs. Thornton's? The meeting went in circles for another 20 minutes, with Ao pressing Hartford on the specifics of the policy and Hartford deflecting, trying to maintain his position without actually having a solid policy to stand on. Finally, clearly overwhelmed and wanting to end this uncomfortable confrontation, Hartford raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. I will review the dress code policy with the school board, he said. In the meantime, I'm asking everyone to remain calm and patient while we sort this out. Ao stood up, taking Amara's hand. My granddaughter will return to class. She will wear her braids as she always has. And I expect that she will be treated with the respect and dignity that every student deserves. As they walked out of the office together, Ao squeezed Amara's hand and leaned down to whisper in her ear. Sometimes, Amara, you must fight for your right to exist as you are. This is one of those times. That evening, Maya sat in her bedroom with her laptop open, anger still burning hot from what she'd witnessed in Mrs. Thornton's classroom. She'd been thinking about it all day, about the look on Amara's face, about the injustice of it all, and she decided she wasn't going to just sit by and watch her best friend fight this battle alone. She opened her browser and navigated to an online petition website. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she typed, Let Amara wear her heritage. Stop cultural discrimination at Riverside Academy. She wrote a passionate description of what had happened, explaining how Amara was being targeted for wearing traditional African braids, how the school was enforcing a vague dress code policy to discriminate against cultural expression. She included a call to action. Sign this petition to demand that Riverside Academy explicitly protect students' rights to wear cultural hairstyles and religious attire without discrimination. Then she hit publish and immediately shared it on every social media platform she had access to, tagging Riverside Academy students, alumni, and community groups. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within the first hour, 50 people had signed. By that night it was 200. And by the next morning when students arrived at school, the petition, Let Amara Wear Her Heritage, had over 500 signatures. But more than that, the comments section had become a place where students were sharing their own stories of discrimination at Riverside Academy. A Sikh boy named Rajesh wrote about being told to remove his patka, a traditional head covering, because it violated the no hats policy, even though it was a religious garment. A black girl named Keisha shared how a teacher had told her that her natural afro looked unprofessional, and suggested she straighten it or wear it in a more controlled style. The stories kept coming, each one revealing a pattern that many students had experienced individually but had never connected collectively. The petition was becoming more than just about Amara, it was exposing a systemic issue at Riverside Academy. The student council held an emergency meeting during lunch that day. Marcus Chin, the student body president, a Chinese-American senior who'd always been diplomatic and measured in his approach to school politics, sat at the head of the table looking at the petition on his phone. The council was divided. Some students were afraid of retaliation, worried that speaking up would hurt their chances for college recommendations or scholarships. "We can't just ignore this," one council member argued. "This is bigger than one student. This is about all of us." But another countered, "If we make this an official student council issue, the administration will see it as insubordination. We could lose our positions." Marcus listened to both sides, his expression thoughtful. He'd worked hard to maintain a good relationship with the administration, had always been the model student who followed the rules and respected authority. But as he read through the comments on the petition, as he saw story after story of students being made to feel ashamed of their culture, their religion, their identity, something shifted inside him. "We bring this to the administration," Marcus finally said, his voice firm with decision. "We present the petition, we present the student stories, and we demand that they address this formally. If we don't stand up for our fellow students now, what's the point of any of this?" The vote was close, but it passed. The student council would officially support the petition and present it to Principal Hartford. Meanwhile, in her classroom during her planning period, Mrs. Patricia Thornton sat at her desk, scrolling through the petition on her computer screen. She read the title, Let Amara Wear Her Heritage, and felt her blood pressure rise. She read through the comments, each one feeling like a personal attack. Students were calling her racist, discriminatory, closed-minded. Some were sharing stories about her specifically, about times she'd made comments about their appearance, their clothing, their hair. Patricia felt cornered, attacked, vilified. She'd spent 28 years building her reputation as a disciplined, excellent educator, and now students were painting her as some kind of villain. Her hands shook as she opened her email and began typing a message to Principal Hartford. "George," she wrote, her fingers striking the keys harder than necessary, "I'm sure you've seen this petition circulating. This is exactly what I feared. We are losing control. These students need to learn respect for authority, for the standards that make this institution what it is. If we give in to this, if we allow students to dictate policy, we will have chaos. They need to understand that rules exist for a reason, and those rules apply to everyone equally. I strongly urge you to address this situation firmly before it spirals further out of control." She hit send and sat back in her chair, her jaw clenched, her whole body tense with defensive anger. 2 days later, on day 4 of this escalating conflict, Amara was called to the principal's office once again. But this time, when she walked in, both Principal Hartford and Mrs. Thornton were waiting for her. The atmosphere was different, colder, more formal. Hartford sat behind his desk looking tired and stressed, while Mrs. Thornton stood off to the side, her arms crossed, her expression hard. Amara felt her stomach twist with anxiety. This didn't feel like a conversation. This felt like a sentencing. Hartford didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Amara, sit down," he said, and there was a weariness in his voice, but also a finality that made her heart race. She sat, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. Hartford sighed deeply and looked at a paper on his desk, as if reading from a script he didn't want to be reading. "Amara, until we complete our review of the dress code policy, you are being suspended from Riverside Academy for 3 days for insubordination." The word hit Amara like a physical blow. "Insubordination?" she repeated, her voice rising with shock and disbelief. "I'm being suspended for my hair? Hartford shifted uncomfortably. You were given clear instructions by a teacher and you chose not to comply. That constitutes insubordination. Amara felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. There is no policy against my hairstyle. You admitted that yourself. How can I be insubordinate for not following a rule that doesn't exist? Mrs. Thornton spoke up from her position by the wall, her voice cold and clipped. You were given multiple opportunities to comply, Miss Williams. You chose defiance. Amara turned to look at her teacher, and in that moment all the respect, all the deference she'd been raised to show to authority figures, evaporated. I chose to be myself, she said, her voice shaking but strong. I chose not to be ashamed of my culture. If that's defiance to you, then I guess I'm guilty. Hartford had already called grandmother Ao, and she arrived within minutes, storming into the principal's office like a force of nature. She didn't even sit down. Explain to me, she demanded, her accent thick with fury, how you are suspending my granddaughter for wearing her hair. Hartford stood up, trying to assert some authority. Mrs. Okonkwo, this is a matter of school discipline. Ao cut him off. This is a matter of discrimination. You have no policy against her hairstyle. You admitted this to me 2 days ago. And now you are punishing a child with perfect grades, a child who has never been in trouble, because she will not erase her culture for you. Hartford tried to maintain his position. It's temporary, just 3 days while we review the policy and allow emotions to settle. Ao stepped closer to his desk, her small frame radiating an intensity that made the principal take a step back. You are punishing a child for her culture. You are teaching her and every other student in this building that being yourself is wrong, that heritage is shameful, that authority is more important than identity. I will not let this stand. Do you hear me? I will not let this stand. But the decision was made. The paperwork was already prepared. Amara Williams was officially suspended for 3 days. As Amara walked out of the school building with her grandmother, her vision blurred with tears she could no longer hold back. Students in the hallway stopped and stared. Word spread through Riverside Academy like wildfire. By the end of the day, everyone knew. Amara Williams had been suspended for wearing braids. The injustice of it, the blatant unfairness, galvanized the student body in a way nothing else could have. That same afternoon, a concerned parent who'd signed the petition reached out to the local chapter of the NAACP. They forwarded the information to attorney Janice Freeman, a 40-something black woman who'd built her career fighting civil rights cases, particularly those involving educational discrimination. Janice sat in her office reading through the petition, the comments, the timeline of events, and she felt that familiar fire ignite in her chest, the one that burned every time she saw injustice being done to a child. She picked up the phone and called the number listed for Ao Okonkwo. When Ao answered, Janice introduced herself and said simply, Mrs. Okonkwo, my name is Janice Freeman and I'm a civil rights attorney. I'd like to offer my services pro bono to help your granddaughter. What's being done to her is wrong and I want to fight it. Ao felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness but from relief, from the knowledge that they weren't alone in this fight anymore. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. Attorney Freeman got to work immediately. She requested copies of Riverside Academy's dress code policy, student handbook, and any communications between the school and the Okonkwo family. As she reviewed the documents, her legal mind identified the problems instantly. The dress code policy was vague, using terms like appropriate appearance and professional standards without any specific definitions. There were no explicit prohibitions against cultural hairstyles, religious attire, or personal expression. But more importantly, the way the policy was being enforced showed a clear pattern of discrimination. Students of color were being targeted for cultural expressions while white students faced no similar scrutiny. Meanwhile, the petition continued to grow exponentially. By the end of the week, it had 2,000 signatures. Local news outlets started picking up the story. A reporter from the community newspaper called Riverside Academy for comment. A local television station sent a crew to interview students outside the school. The story was no longer contained within the walls of Riverside Academy. It was becoming public, and with that publicity came pressure. Mrs. Patricia Thornton sat in her living room that evening, watching the local news coverage of the Riverside Academy discrimination controversy. They showed photos of Amara, her beautiful braids and beads clearly visible. They interviewed students who talked about the petition, about their own experiences. And then they mentioned her by name. The conflict began when veteran teacher Patricia Thornton told student Amara Williams that her traditional African braids violated school policy. Patricia felt her world tilting. Her name was on the news. She was being painted as the villain in this story. Her phone started ringing, friends and family members calling to ask if she was okay, what was happening. Some calls were supportive, but others were confrontational. A cousin she hadn't spoken to in years called to ask, "Patty, what were you thinking?" She turned off her phone and sat in the dark, feeling cornered, attacked, defensive. In her mind, she wasn't discriminating. She was maintaining standards. She was doing her job. Why couldn't anyone see that? Principal Hartford was also having a terrible evening. School board members were calling, demanding to know what was going on, why this situation had been allowed to escalate, why the school was getting negative media coverage. The superintendent called, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, asking for a full report by morning. Hartford sat in his home office, looking at 2 years until retirement that suddenly felt like an eternity. He'd wanted to end his career quietly, peacefully, with a nice ceremony and a gold watch. Instead, he was presiding over a discrimination scandal. And Amara? Amara sat at her kitchen table at home, her grandmother beside her, her textbooks spread out in front of her. She'd been suspended, yes, but she refused to fall behind in her studies. She worked through her algebra problems, read her assigned chapters for history, prepared for the debate competition that she might not even be allowed to participate in anymore. Ao watched her granddaughter with fierce pride. "You are so strong, my dear," she said softly. Amara looked up, her eyes tired but determined. "I don't feel strong, Grandma. I feel scared." Ao reached out and touched Amara's braids gently, the same way she'd done hundreds of times before. Strength is not the absence of fear. Strength is doing what is right even when you are afraid. That night, in 2 different homes across the same city, 2 very different people sat in darkness and thought about the same conflict from opposite sides. Amara, suspended and hurt, wondering if standing up for herself was worth all this pain. And Patricia Thornton, defensive and angry, wondering how doing her job had turned her into a villain. The battle lines were drawn. The community was watching. And this fight was far from over. If you think this story is important and you want to see what happens next when this battle explodes into something even bigger, hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss a single moment of what's coming. And I need to ask you something. If you were a student at Riverside Academy, would you have signed the petition supporting Amara, or would you have stayed silent to avoid getting involved? Let me know in the comments because your voice matters in conversations like these. Attorney Janice Freeman sat in her office late into the night, surrounded by documents, her reading glasses perched on her nose, a cold cup of coffee forgotten on her desk. She'd been a civil rights attorney for nearly 2 decades, and she knew that cases like Amara's were rarely just about one incident. There was always a pattern, always a history, always something deeper beneath the surface. And she was determined to find it. She started with a deep dive into Riverside Academy's institutional history, requesting public records, examining enrollment data, reviewing policy changes over the past 20 years. What she discovered made her blood run cold. 10 years ago, in 2015, Riverside Academy had undergone a significant demographic shift. The neighborhood around the school had become more diverse as housing developments brought in families from different racial and economic backgrounds. The student population, which had been predominantly white for decades, suddenly included a substantial increase in Black, Latino, and Asian students. The numbers were clear. In 2014, Riverside Academy was 78% white. By 2016, that number had dropped to 52%. And here's what made Freeman's legal instincts scream. The dress code policy had been completely rewritten in late 2015, right in the middle of that demographic transition. She pulled up the old policy from 2014 and compared it to the new one implemented in 2015. The original policy was simple and straightforward. Students should dress in a manner appropriate for a learning environment, no offensive graphics or revealing clothing. But the 2015 version was different. It was loaded with subjective language, professional appearance, appropriate grooming standards, hairstyles that do not create distraction, maintaining the Academy's traditional culture. Freeman filed a public records request for all emails and communications related to the dress code policy change. What came back was damning. There were dozens of emails from a committee formed to revise the policy, and one of the most vocal members of that committee was Mrs. Patricia Thornton. Freeman read through the email chain, her anger growing with each message. In one email from November 2015, Mrs. Thornton had written, "We need to maintain the Academy's traditional culture and standards. With the changing student demographics, it's more important than ever that we establish clear expectations for appropriate appearance." Another email from Thornton read, "I've noticed an increase in distracting hairstyles and jewelry. We should have explicit language about what constitutes professional grooming. And another, standards of excellence aren't just about academics. They're about presenting oneself in a manner befitting Riverside's reputation. Freeman printed out every single email, highlighting the most problematic language. This wasn't just about Amara's braids. This was about a systematic effort to enforce conformity in response to increasing diversity. The next morning, Freeman called AO and asked if she and Amara could come to her office. They arrived that afternoon, Amara still in the middle of her suspension, wearing jeans and a sweater, her braids pulled back with the beads creating a soft pattern down her back. Freeman spread the documents across her conference table and walked them through everything she'd found. AO's face grew darker with each revelation, her hands clenching into fists. Amara sat very still, reading the emails from Mrs. Thornton, and Freeman watched as different emotions played across the young girl's face. Shock, hurt, anger, and then something else, something like clarity. She wrote this. Amara asked quietly, holding up one of the printed emails. She actually wrote that we needed to maintain traditional culture right after more black and brown students started enrolling? Freeman nodded. She did. And she wasn't the only one, but she was one of the loudest voices pushing for these changes. Amara sat back in her chair and Freeman saw tears gathering in her eyes. I thought maybe she just didn't understand. I thought maybe if I explained about my culture, about what my braids mean, she would see. But this. She gestured to the emails. This wasn't about understanding. This was planned. AO reached over and took her granddaughter's hand. This is what I tried to tell you, my dear. Sometimes discrimination is not loud. Sometimes it hides behind words like standards and tradition. Freeman leaned forward, her voice serious but compassionate. Amara, AO, what I found here shows a clear pattern of discrimination. This isn't just about hair. This is about a school that systematically changed its policies to target students of color. We can fight this, but it means going public. It means media attention, scrutiny, pressure. It won't be easy. Amara was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes drifted to her bag, where she tucked a small framed photo of her mother, the one she carried everywhere. She pulled it out and looked at it, at her mother's warm smile, at the way her mother wore her own braids with such pride. Freeman and AO waited, giving her the time she needed to make this decision. Finally, Amara looked up, and there was steel in her young eyes. Yes, she said, her voice firm and clear. I am ready to fight this publicly. Because if I don't, the next girl who looks like me will go through the same thing. And the one after that. This is bigger than just my hair. This has to stop. Freeman smiled, a fierce, proud smile. Then let's make some noise. And that's exactly what they did. Freeman reached out to the local news stations that had already been covering the story and offered them an exclusive interview with Amara and AO. Within 24 hours, a news crew was set up in the Okonkwo's modest living room, cameras and lights transforming their small space into a makeshift studio. The interviewer, a seasoned journalist named Patricia Thornton, sat across from Amara and AO, her expression serious and empathetic. Amara, Patricia Thornton began gently, you're 14 years old, an honor student, president of the debate team, and you've been suspended from school. Tell me in your own words what happened. Amara sat up straight, her grandmother beside her, and when she spoke, her voice was clear, articulate, mature beyond her 14 years. I wore my braids to school, the same braids I've worn for years, the same braids that connect me to my Nigerian heritage, to my mother who passed away, to generations of strong African women. And I was told they were a distraction, that they violated school policy, even though no such policy exists. She paused, choosing her words carefully. My braids don't stop me from learning. They help me remember who I am. They help me stay connected to my roots, to my culture, to my mother's memory. When Mrs. Thornton told me to remove them, she wasn't just asking me to change my hairstyle. She was asking me to erase a part of my identity. The camera captured the emotion in her eyes, the intelligence, the quiet strength. I couldn't do that. I won't do that. Not for anyone. The interview aired that evening on the local news, and within hours, it had been picked up by regional outlets. By the next morning, it had gone viral on social media. The video of Amara, this poised, articulate 14-year-old girl explaining why her cultural identity mattered, spread across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. People were sharing it with comments like, "This is what courage looks like," and "She's 14 and more eloquent than most adults," and "Her mother would be so proud." A hashtag emerged organically, #LetAmaraLearn. Within 48 hours, it was trending not just locally but regionally. Students from other schools started sharing their own stories of cultural discrimination, of being told their hair was unprofessional, their clothing inappropriate, their religious garments distracting. The conversation Amara had started was sparking a much larger reckoning about how schools policed the appearance and identity of students of color. Community organizers mobilized quickly. A coalition of parents, students, and civil rights activists organized a protest outside the school board offices. On a cold weekday afternoon, more than 300 people gathered, holding signs that read, "Protect cultural expression," "Black hair is beautiful," "Let Amara learn," and "Stop discriminating against our children." The protest was peaceful but powerful, with speakers sharing personal stories, leading chants, demanding action from the school board. Supportive messages poured in from across the country. Civil rights organizations issued statements supporting Amara. Education advocacy groups called for policy reforms. And then the celebrities and public figures started weighing in. A famous actress who'd grown up in a similar situation tweeted, "I was Amara 30 years ago. I was told my braids were unprofessional. I was made to feel ashamed of my culture. We cannot keep doing this to our children. #Let Amara learn." A prominent activist shared the story with commentary about the school-to-prison pipeline and how policing black girls' appearance is part of a larger system of oppression. The attention was overwhelming and not all of it was positive. Because with the spotlight came scrutiny, and that scrutiny fell heavily on Mrs. Patricia Thornton. Her name, which had been mentioned in the initial local coverage, was now everywhere. People dug up her emails from the public records request and shared them on social media. Someone created a thread on Twitter laying out the timeline: the demographic shift at Riverside, the policy change, Thornton's role in it, the emails she'd written. The thread went viral, reshared thousands of times. Mrs. Thornton's social media accounts, which she rarely used, were suddenly flooded with angry messages. People she didn't know were calling her racist, discriminatory, a symbol of everything wrong with the education system. Her phone rang constantly with reporters requesting interviews, which she declined. Her email inbox was overwhelmed. And worst of all, people she'd known for years, colleagues and acquaintances, started distancing themselves. A teacher she'd worked with for 15 years crossed the street to avoid talking to her. A friend from her book club sent a terse text: "I think it's best if you don't come to our meetings for a while." Patricia Thornton felt like her entire world was collapsing. She'd spent 28 years building her reputation as an excellent educator, a woman of standards and integrity, and now she was being painted as a villain, a racist, someone who deliberately targeted a child. She stopped sleeping through the night. She stopped eating regular meals. She'd sit in her apartment watching the news coverage of herself, reading the social media posts about her, feeling attacked from all sides. In her mind, she was the victim here. She'd simply been doing her job, maintaining the standards that made Riverside Academy a respected institution, and now she was being destroyed for it. But there was something else happening too, something she couldn't quite name. Late one evening, unable to sleep, Patricia drove to Riverside Academy and let herself into her dark, empty classroom. She turned on just her desk lamp, casting long shadows across the room, and sat in the quiet space where she'd taught thousands of students over nearly 3 decades. Her eyes fell on the photograph on her desk, the one she'd looked at 1,000 times but tried not to really see. She picked it up, a photo from 20 years ago showing her with Diane Morris. Diane had been one of Patricia's closest friends when they'd both been young teachers at Riverside. Diane was black, brilliant, passionate about literature, and the two of them had spent countless hours discussing books, sharing lesson plans, supporting each other through the challenges of the profession. In the photo, they had their arms around each other's shoulders, both smiling genuinely, caught in a moment of real friendship. But Diane had left Riverside Academy abruptly 15 years ago, and Patricia had never quite let herself examine why. Sitting in the dark classroom, Patricia allowed herself to remember. She remembered the way administrators had scrutinized Diane's teaching methods more heavily than other teachers. She remembered comments made in faculty meetings about Diane's unconventional approach, even though her students loved her and learned from her. She remembered the day Diane had come to her, upset about being passed over for a department chair position despite her qualifications, and Patricia had said, "Maybe they're right. Maybe you need more experience." She remembered Diane's expression, the hurt in her eyes, the realization that even her friend wouldn't stand up for her. Patricia had told herself she was being professional, staying neutral, not making waves. When Diane eventually left for a position at another school, Patricia had convinced herself it was for the best, that Diane just wasn't a good fit for Riverside's culture. But now, sitting in the darkness, Patricia forced herself to confront the truth she'd been avoiding for 15 years. She had failed her friend. She had watched discrimination happen and had chosen comfort over courage. And the thing that made her stomach turn was this. She was doing the same thing to Amara that had been done to Diane. Maybe she'd been doing it all along, telling herself it was about standards when really it was about who was allowed to set those standards, who was allowed to define what professional and appropriate meant. Her phone rang, startling her out of her thoughts. It was her sister Karen calling from 2 states away. Patricia almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Patty," Karen said, her voice tight with emotion, "I've been seeing the news. I've been reading the articles. What are you doing?" Patricia felt defensive walls slam up immediately. "I'm doing my job, Karen. I'm maintaining standards at my school." Karen was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was firm. "Standards? Patty, I've seen the emails. I've read what you wrote about maintaining traditional culture, right after more black and brown kids enrolled. Do you hear yourself? Do you understand what you're saying?" Patricia's voice rose. "I was trying to preserve what made Riverside Academy excellent. Since when is that wrong?" Her sister's response cut through her defenses like a knife. "Since those standards only seem to apply to students who don't look like you, Patty. That's when it became wrong." "You don't understand," Patricia started, but Karen interrupted. "I understand perfectly. You've turned yourself into exactly the kind of person Mom would have been ashamed of. Remember when we were kids and Mom taught at that integrated school and she'd come home talking about fighting for every child to be treated fairly? What would she say about this?" Patricia felt tears burning in her eyes. "That's not fair." Karen's voice softened but remained firm. "What's not fair is what you did to that child, Patty. That 14-year-old girl who lost her mother and wears her braids to stay connected to her heritage. What's not fair is using your position of power to make her feel ashamed of who she is." Patricia couldn't respond. The words stuck in her throat. "I love you, sister," Karen said quietly. "But I can't support what you're doing. And I think deep down you know it's wrong too. The question is whether you're brave enough to admit it." And then she hung up. Patricia sat in her dark classroom holding her dead phone, her sister's words echoing in her mind. She looked at the photo of herself and Diane again. She thought about her mother who dedicated her life to education and equality. She thought about Amara Williams, about the look on that young girl's face when she'd called her to the front of the class, about the sound of those beads clicking as Amara's hands had shaken with humiliation. And for the first time since this entire situation had started, Patricia Thornton allowed herself to feel something other than defensive anger. She felt shame. Real, deep, soul-crushing shame. Because her sister was right. Her standards had only applied to students who didn't look like her. She had used words like traditional culture and appropriate appearance as weapons to enforce conformity, to push back against diversity, to maintain a version of Riverside Academy that reflected her comfort rather than serving all students. She had become the very thing she'd always told herself she wasn't. She had become the discriminator. Patricia sat in that dark classroom for hours, crying quietly, years of buried guilt and present shame pouring out of her. Something inside her was breaking, but maybe, just maybe, it was something that needed to break so that something better could grow in its place. Meanwhile, the pressure on the school board had reached a breaking point. The petition had over 5,000 signatures. The protests were growing larger. Media attention was intense. The school board called an emergency public meeting to address the situation, and they made it clear. This meeting would determine the future of the dress code policy at Riverside Academy. The night of the meeting, the school board chambers were packed beyond capacity. Every seat was filled, people stood along the walls, lined up in the hallways, spilled out into the parking lot where speakers were set up so everyone could hear. Local news cameras were positioned around the room. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. The 7 school board members sat at their table at the front of the room, looking visibly uncomfortable with the attention, with the crowd, with the magnitude of what they were facing. Principal George Hartford sat at a side table, his expression haggard. He'd aged 10 years in the past 2 weeks. And sitting in the audience, trying to make herself as small as possible, was Mrs. Patricia Thornton. She'd almost stayed home, but something had compelled her to come, to witness this, to face what she'd helped create. Attorney Janice Freeman stood at the podium when her turn came to speak, and she commanded the room with the authority of someone who'd fought these battles many times before. She laid out the evidence methodically, presenting the timeline of demographic changes, the policy revision, the emails showing deliberate intent to enforce conformity in response to diversity. "This is not about one student," Freeman said, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. "This is about a pattern of discrimination that has been built into the very policies of this institution. This is about a school that decided that diversity was a problem to be managed rather than a strength to be celebrated. She presented data showing that disciplinary actions related to dress code violations disproportionately affected students of color. She showed examples of subjective enforcement. White students wearing certain styles facing no consequences while black and brown students wearing similar styles being punished. Then came the testimony from students, and this was when the meeting became truly powerful. Marcus Chin, the student body president, spoke about his friend Rajesh, a Sikh student who'd been told to remove his patka because of a no hats policy, even though it was a religious garment, not a hat. Maya Rodriguez testified about being sent home for wearing hoop earrings that were described as too large and distracting, even though white students wore similar jewelry without comment. A black student named Keisha shared how a teacher had told her that her natural afro looked unkempt, and suggested she straighten it or wear it in a more controlled style for picture day. Story after story, student after student, a pattern emerged that was undeniable. Parents testified next, emotional and angry, talking about their children coming home in tears, feeling ashamed of their culture, learning that who they were wasn't acceptable in the eyes of their school. And then Ao Akonkwo stood up to speak. She walked slowly to the podium, a small woman in traditional Nigerian attire, and when she began to speak, her accented voice carried the weight of generations. "My granddaughter's hair is not a distraction," she said, looking directly at each school board member. "It is her heritage. It is her history. It is her connection to her mother, who she lost too young, and to her ancestors, who survived unimaginable hardship." Ao's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "When you tell a child that their culture is inappropriate, you are not teaching them standards. You are teaching them shame. You are teaching them that to belong they must erase themselves. You are teaching them that excellence looks like you, sounds like you, appears like you, and anything different is less than." She paused, letting her words sink in. Education should expand minds, not narrow identities. If Riverside Academy cannot embrace all its students as they are, then Riverside Academy has failed in its fundamental mission. The room erupted in applause. People stood up, clapping, some wiping tears from their eyes. The school board members looked at each other, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. And then it was Amara's turn to speak. 14-year-old Amara Williams walked to the podium, and the room fell completely silent. Every eye was on her, this young girl who'd sparked a movement simply by refusing to be ashamed of who she was. She adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "My name is Amara Williams," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her obvious nervousness. "I'm 14 years old. I'm in 8th grade. I have a 4.0 grade average. I'm president of the debate team. I want to be a civil rights attorney when I grow up." She paused, gathering her courage. 2 weeks ago, I was called to the front of my English class and humiliated in front of all my peers because of my hair. I was suspended from school for refusing to remove my braids. And I want you to understand what that felt like. Amara's voice grew more emotional but remained strong. "These braids are not just a hairstyle to me. They're a connection to my mother, who passed away 2 years ago. She used to braid my hair every Sunday, and she would tell me stories about our ancestors, about strong African women who wore their hair as crowns. When my grandmother braids my hair now, I can feel my mother's presence. When I touch these beads, I can hear her voice." A tear rolled down Amara's cheek, but she kept speaking. "When Mrs. Thornton told me to remove my braids, she wasn't asking me to change my appearance. She was asking me to erase my mother's memory. She was asking me to be ashamed of my heritage." But then Amara did something remarkable. Instead of attacking Mrs. Thornton, instead of making it personal, she elevated the conversation. "I don't think Mrs. Thornton understood what she was asking of me. I don't think she meant to hurt me the way she did. But that's exactly why we need clear policies that protect cultural expression. Because even good people can cause harm when they don't understand, when they haven't examined their own biases, when they enforce standards that were never meant to include people who look like me." Amara looked directly at the school board members. "I'm asking you to do more than just change a policy. I'm asking you to send a message to every student at Riverside Academy that they belong exactly as they are. That their culture is valuable. That their identity is not a distraction but a strength. That excellence doesn't require conformity." She took a breath. "My braids don't stop me from learning. They help me remember who I am. And every student deserves the right to remember who they are while they learn." The room exploded in applause. People were standing, clapping, crying. The school board members looked shaken, moved, confronted with the undeniable truth of what they'd allowed to happen. After several more testimonies, The board chair called for a vote on a motion to immediately suspend the current dress code policy pending a complete review and revision with input from students, parents, and community members. The vote was unanimous, 7-0. The discriminatory dress code was suspended effective immediately. The room erupted in celebration. People hugged each other, cried tears of joy and relief, celebrated a victory that felt monumental. But as Amara watched from her seat, her grandmother's arm around her, she felt something complicated. Yes, this was a victory. Yes, the policy had been suspended. But Mrs. Thornton was still sitting in that audience, and nothing had been resolved between them. The policy might change, but had hearts changed? Had minds changed? Amara didn't know the answer to that question yet. If this story is moving you, if you want to see how this situation resolves and whether real change can happen not just in policy but in people's hearts, you need to subscribe right now because what happens next will surprise you. And I have to ask you, do you think changing policies is enough to end discrimination, or does real change require something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments because this conversation matters. The morning Amara Williams returned to Riverside Academy felt surreal, like stepping back into a world that had fundamentally changed even though everything looked exactly the same. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror that morning, her grandmother Ao behind her, making the final adjustments to her braids. The golden and amber beads caught the morning light, creating tiny points of brilliance that seemed to dance with every movement. "Are you ready, my dear?" Ao asked softly, her hands resting gently on Amara's shoulders. Amara looked at her reflection, at the young woman staring back at her, and she barely recognized herself. 3 weeks ago she'd been just a student. Now she was a symbol of something much larger. "I don't want to be a symbol, Grandma," Amara said quietly. "I just want to learn. I just want to go to school and be a normal kid again." Ao smiled sadly and turned Amara around to face her. "I know, my love. But sometimes we do not choose our battles. Sometimes they choose us. And when they do, all we can do is walk forward with dignity." Amara nodded, swallowing hard against the anxiety rising in her chest. The school board had suspended the discriminatory dress code. She had won technically. But winning on paper didn't erase the very real fear she felt about walking back into Mrs. Thornton's classroom, about facing the woman who had humiliated her, about sitting in a room where she'd been made to feel ashamed of who she was. Maya was waiting outside Amara's house, just like she had been every morning before all of this happened. When Amara walked out, Maya broke into a huge grin. There she is. The girl who changed everything. Amara felt tears prick her eyes. "Maya, stop. I can't handle that right now. I'm terrified." Maya walked over and linked her arm through Amara's. "I know you are. But you've got this. And I've got you. We walk in there together, okay?" Together they headed toward Riverside Academy, and with every step, Amara felt her heart beating faster. When they entered the school building, something unexpected happened. Students in the hallway began to notice Amara, and instead of the whispers and stares she'd experienced before, there was applause. Actual applause. Students she barely knew were clapping, some were cheering, others were giving her thumbs up and words of encouragement. "You did it, Amara," someone called out. "Thank you for standing up," another voice shouted. A group of black girls she recognized from the upper grades approached her, all wearing their natural hair in various styles. Afros, braids, locks, twist-outs. "Because of you we can wear our hair with pride," one of them said, her eyes shining with gratitude. Amara felt overwhelmed, almost dizzy with the attention. She smiled and thanked people, but inside she felt a strange disconnect. These students were celebrating her as a hero, as someone who'd fought a battle and won. But all she'd done was refuse to be ashamed of her hair. All she'd done was insist on being herself. Was that really heroism, or was it just basic human dignity? The fact that it had become such a big deal made her sad for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. As they got closer to Mrs. Thornton's English literature classroom, the celebratory atmosphere faded and Amara's anxiety came roaring back. Her palms were sweating. Her stomach was in knots. Maya squeezed her arm. "You've got this," she whispered one more time. Amara took a deep breath and walked through the classroom door. Every single eye in that room turned to look at her. The conversation that had been happening stopped mid-sentence. It was like time froze. And there, at the front of the classroom, sitting at her desk with papers spread out before her, was Mrs. Patricia Thornton. The teacher looked up and for a moment their eyes met. Amara tried to read the expression on her teacher's face, but it was unreadable, carefully neutral. Mrs. Thornton's gaze moved briefly to Amara's braids, to the beads that adorned them, and then back to her face. Neither woman spoke. Amara walked to her usual seat, her legs feeling shaky, and sat down. The beads in her braids clicked softly as she moved, and in the absolute silence of that classroom, the sound seemed deafening. She set her books on her desk, pulled out her notebook, and stared down at the blank page, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The other students watched this silent interaction with bated breath, waiting to see what would happen, whether there would be another confrontation, another explosion. Mrs. Thornton stood up from her desk, walked to the front of the classroom, and picked up a piece of chalk. Without looking at anyone, without acknowledging the tension that was thick enough to choke on, she simply began the class. "Today we'll be continuing our discussion of symbolism in literature," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Please open your books to page 147. Just like that, class started. No acknowledgement of what had happened. No recognition of the past 3 weeks. Just English literature as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and every person in that room knew it. The tension was palpable. Students kept glancing between Amara and Mrs. Thornton, waiting for something, anything. Amara tried to focus on the lesson, tried to take notes like she normally would, but her mind was racing. Was this it? Was Mrs. Thornton just going to pretend nothing had happened? Was there going to be no acknowledgement of the pain, the humiliation, the fight that had consumed the past 3 weeks? Amara felt anger building inside her chest, hot and tight. She'd stood up in front of the school board and spoken her truth. She'd been on the news. She'd started a movement. And Mrs. Thornton was just going to act like it was any other Tuesday? The 50-minute class period felt like the longest of Amara's life. When the bell finally rang, students gathered their things quickly, eager to escape the uncomfortable tension. Amara started packing up her books, her hands moving mechanically. And then she heard it, quiet but clear. "Miss Williams, may I speak with you privately for a moment?" Amara's head snapped up. Mrs. Thornton was standing at the front of the classroom, her expression still carefully neutral, but there was something in her eyes, something that looked almost like fear. Every instinct in Amara's body told her to say no, to walk out, to avoid this conversation. But something else, something deeper, made her nod. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maya, who was standing by the door waiting for her friend, looked concerned. "Amara?" she asked, a question in her voice. "It's okay," Amara said, though she wasn't sure if that was true. "Wait outside. I'll be right there." Maya hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be right outside this door," she said, giving Mrs. Thornton a look that clearly communicated she was watching. The last student filed out, and suddenly the classroom was empty except for Amara and Mrs. Thornton. The teacher walked over and closed the door, not all the way, just enough to give them privacy. Then she turned to face Amara, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched out, awkward and heavy. Mrs. Thornton seemed to be struggling with something, her mouth opening and closing, words failing to come. Amara stood by her desk, her arms crossed protectively across her chest, her heart pounding, waiting. Finally, Mrs. Thornton spoke, and her voice was different than Amara had ever heard it before. Not stern, not authoritative, not controlled. It was shaky, uncertain, vulnerable. "I owe you an apology," she said, and the words seemed to come haltingly, as if each one was being dragged out of her against tremendous resistance. "What I did to you was wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong." Amara didn't move, didn't respond, just watched her teacher with guarded eyes. Mrs. Thornton took a breath and continued, her hands twisting together nervously. "I told myself I was maintaining standards. I told myself I was preserving the excellence of this institution. I convinced myself that what I was doing was right, that it was my job, my responsibility." She looked up at Amara, and there were tears in her eyes. "But the truth is, I didn't see my own bias. I didn't recognize that my idea of appropriate and professional was based on my own narrow experience, my own limited perspective. I enforced conformity and called it standards. I punished difference and called it discipline." Mrs. Thornton walked over to her desk and picked up the old photograph, the one of her and Diane Morris. She held it so Amara could see it. "This was my friend Diane Morris. We taught together here 20 years ago. She was brilliant, passionate, one of the best educators I've ever known. She was also black, and she faced discrimination at this school, subtle but constant. And when she needed someone to stand up for her, when she needed her friend to speak out, I stayed silent." Her voice broke. "I told myself I was being professional, staying neutral, not making waves. But the truth is, I was a coward. And she left Riverside because people like me made it unbearable for her to stay." Amara listened, her arms still crossed, her expression still guarded, but something was shifting inside her. This wasn't what she'd expected. I've spent 28 years at this school, Mrs. Thornton continued, believing that tradition and excellence meant sameness. Believing that for students to succeed, they needed to look a certain way, speak a certain way, present themselves in a way that matched my comfort zone. I was wrong. And I've hurt people because of it. I hurt Diane. I hurt you. I've probably hurt countless students over the years without even realizing it. Amara finally spoke, her voice tight with emotion. Mrs. Thornton, you humiliated me in front of my entire class. You called my culture a distraction. You had me suspended for being myself. Do you understand what that did to me? Her voice rose, all the pain and anger of the past weeks pouring out. These braids are my connection to my mother, who I lost. They're my connection to my heritage, to generations of women who survived unspeakable things. And you told me to remove them like they were nothing more than accessories. Tears were streaming down Amara's face now, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. You made me feel ashamed of who I am. You made me question whether I belonged in your classroom in this school. You used your power to try to erase me. Mrs. Thornton was crying too, quiet tears running down her cheeks. I know, she said, her voice barely audible. I know, and I am so deeply, profoundly sorry. There is nothing I can say that will undo what I did. There is no apology adequate enough for the harm I caused you. She took a shaky breath. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. I see my bias. I see my failures. And I can't undo it, Amara, but I want to do better. I need to do better. The two women stood there in the empty classroom, teacher and student, both crying, both raw with emotion. This wasn't easy. This wasn't simple. There was no magic moment of understanding that made everything okay. Amara looked at her teacher, at this woman who had hurt her so deeply, who was now standing before her broken and apologetic, and she felt a complicated mix of emotions. Anger, pain, but also something unexpected. A tiny seed of possibility. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Amara said honestly, her voice steady despite her tears. What you did hurt me in ways I'm still processing. But, she paused, choosing her words carefully, I appreciate you saying this. I appreciate you acknowledging what you did wrong. Mrs. Thornton nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. That's more than I deserve. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for giving me even that much. Amara gathered her books and headed toward the door, then paused and turned back. Mrs. Thornton? Real change isn't just about apologizing. It's about what you do next. And with that, she walked out, leaving her teacher standing alone in the empty classroom. 2 weeks later, the school board held another public meeting, this time to vote on a new, revised dress code policy. The community showed up again, not in protest this time but in anticipation. Attorney Janice Freeman had worked with a committee of students, parents, educators, and community members to draft a policy that explicitly protected cultural hairstyles, religious expression, and personal identity while still maintaining reasonable standards for a learning environment. The proposed policy was clear, specific, and equitable. It had been published for public comment, and the overwhelming response had been supportive. The board chamber was packed once again, but the energy was different. There was still tension, still anticipation, but also hope. The school board members took their seats, and the meeting began with the presentation of the new policy. Various committee members spoke about the process, about the input they'd received, about the importance of creating an inclusive environment for all students. And then something unexpected happened. The board chair announced that Mrs. Patricia Thornton had requested to speak, and a shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Amara, sitting in the audience with her grandmother and Maya, felt her stomach drop. What was this? What was Mrs. Thornton doing? She watched as her teacher stood up from where she'd been sitting in the back of the room and slowly walked to the podium. Patricia Thornton looked different. She seemed smaller somehow, less imposing, more vulnerable. She adjusted the microphone with shaking hands and looked out at the packed room, at all the faces staring at her, some with curiosity, some with hostility, some with judgment. My name is Patricia Thornton, she began, her voice trembling but clear. I've been a teacher at Riverside Academy for 28 years. And I am the person who started this crisis. The room went absolutely silent. 3 weeks ago, I called a student to the front of my classroom and told her that her beautiful, culturally significant braids were inappropriate. I used my position of authority to try to force her to conform to my narrow, biased view of what appropriate looked like. I humiliated her in front of her peers. And when she stood up for herself, I had her suspended. Mrs. Thornton's voice grew stronger, more deliberate. I am here tonight to publicly apologize to Amara Williams and to her grandmother, Mrs. Ao Okonkwo. I am here to acknowledge that what I did was discriminatory, harmful, and wrong. I cannot undo the pain I caused, but I can take responsibility for it. She paused, gathering herself. I've spent the past 2 weeks doing some difficult self-examination. I've been forced to confront biases I didn't know I had, to examine assumptions I'd never questioned. I reached out to a former colleague, a black woman named Diane Morris who left this school 15 years ago because of the discrimination she faced here, discrimination I witnessed and did nothing to stop. The audience stirred. This was not what they'd expected. Diane is here tonight, Mrs. Thornton said, gesturing to a woman sitting in the middle section. Diane Morris stood up briefly, a dignified woman in her 50s, and nodded acknowledgement. She has graciously agreed to reconnect with me, though she had every right not to. We've been talking about her experience at Riverside, about the ways the institution failed her, about the ways I failed her as a friend and colleague. And those conversations have opened my eyes to patterns I'd been blind to for decades. Mrs. Thornton looked directly at the school board. I am enrolling in cultural competency training. I am working with the school's diversity committee to examine my curriculum and teaching practices. I am committed to bringing more diverse voices, more varied perspectives into my English literature classroom. Students should see themselves reflected in the books we read, the authors we study, the stories we tell. She turned to look at the community. I know that some of you will never forgive me, and I understand that. I know that an apology doesn't erase harm. But I am committed to doing better, to being better, to using my remaining years in education to create the kind of inclusive environment I should have been creating all along. Finally, she looked directly at Amara. Amara, you showed more courage and grace at 14 years old than I've shown in my entire career. You stood up for yourself and for countless other students who've been made to feel that they don't belong. You changed this institution for the better. Thank you. The room was absolutely silent as Mrs. Thornton walked back to her seat. Some people seemed moved, others skeptical. This wasn't a Hollywood moment where everyone stood and applauded and all was forgiven. This was messy and complicated and real. Amara sat very still, her grandmother's hand in hers, feeling a complicated swirl of emotions. Anger was still there. Pain was still there. But there was also something else, something like recognition that real accountability looked like this. Public, uncomfortable, vulnerable. The school board voted on the new dress code policy, and the vote was unanimous, 7-0. The policy passed, with explicit protections for cultural hairstyles including braids, locks, twists, afros and cornrows, as well as religious expression including head coverings and personal identity. The crowd erupted in applause, people standing, celebrating, embracing. It was a victory, real and tangible. But as Amara watched Mrs. Thornton sitting alone in the back of the room while everyone else celebrated, she felt the complexity of it all. Justice had been served, yes. But healing would take much longer. Weeks passed and slowly Riverside Academy began to change in visible ways. Mrs. Thornton's classroom was the most dramatic transformation. Gone were the posters of exclusively white European authors. In their place were images and quotes from Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Sandra Cisneros, Ocean Vuong, and countless other voices from marginalized communities. The bookshelves, once filled primarily with classic Western canon, now included diverse contemporary voices. And Mrs. Thornton's teaching approach had shifted. She was asking different questions, creating space for different perspectives, actively working to make her classroom more inclusive. The day they started their new unit on identity and literature from marginalized voices, Mrs. Thornton began class with a reading from Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. As she read the passage about Pecola Breedlove and the internalized racism that made her wish for blue eyes, for whiteness, for erasure of her blackness, the classroom was completely silent. When she finished, she looked up at her students. This is what happens when we teach children that beauty, that worth, that excellence looks only one way. We create Pecolas. We create young people who hate themselves, who wish to be anything other than what they are. Amara, sitting in her usual seat with her braids adorned with golden beads, found herself raising her hand. Mrs. Thornton called on her, and there was a moment of connection between them, brief but real. I think Morrison is showing us that the real tragedy isn't just what Pecola experiences externally, it's how she internalizes it, Amara said, her voice thoughtful. The most devastating discrimination isn't just what people do to you. It's when you start to believe them, when you start to see yourself through their eyes instead of your own. Mrs. Thornton nodded, her eyes shining with something like pride. That's exactly right, Amara. And that's why it's so important that we create spaces where young people can see themselves, can celebrate themselves, can be themselves without fear of judgment or punishment. It wasn't a grand gesture of reconciliation, but it was progress. It was the beginning of something. After class, as students filed out, Amara took her time gathering her things. Mrs. Thornton was erasing the board, and for a moment, they were alone again. "Amara," Mrs. Thornton said quietly, not turning around, "your insights in class today were brilliant. You're going to make an exceptional civil rights attorney someday." Amara paused at the door. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever completely. But it was acknowledgement. It was the slow, difficult work of healing. That afternoon, as Amara walked out of the school building, she saw her grandmother Ao waiting by the car, just like she had been every day since this whole situation began. Ao's face broke into a smile when she saw her granddaughter, and she opened her arms wide. Amara walked into that embrace and let herself be held. "How was your day, my dear?" Ao asked, stroking Amara's braids gently. Amara pulled back and looked at her grandmother, at the strength and wisdom in her weathered face. "It was good, Grandma. We're reading Toni Morrison in English class now. And Mrs. Thornton, she's trying. Really trying." Ao nodded, understanding all the complexity contained in that simple statement. "You stood up, Amara. When it would have been easier to stay silent, to make yourself smaller, to erase yourself for comfort, you stood up. Your mother would be so proud of you." Amara reached up and touched her braids, feeling the smooth beads beneath her fingers, hearing the soft clicking sound they made. She thought about her mother, about all the Sunday evenings spent between her legs getting her hair braided, about the stories told and the love shared. She thought about her grandmother's hands now doing the same work, carrying on the tradition. She thought about all the young girls at Riverside Academy and schools across the country who would now be able to wear their hair with pride, without fear, because she had refused to be ashamed. "I know, Grandma," Amara said softly, tears gathering in her eyes. "I know she would be." They stood there together in the afternoon sun, grandmother and granddaughter, connected by braids and beads and an unbreakable bond of love and heritage. The fight wasn't over. Policies could be changed, but hearts and minds took longer. But for today, for this moment, it was enough to know that she had made a difference, that she had stood in her truth, that she had honored her mother's memory and her ancestors' legacy by simply refusing to erase herself. If you want to see how this powerful story concludes and witness the lasting impact of one girl's courage, you absolutely need to subscribe right now, because the final chapter will bring everything full circle in the most meaningful way. And here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever had to choose between fitting in and being true to yourself? What did you choose and what did it cost you? Share your story in the comments, because these conversations create community and change. 6 months had passed since the school board voted to change the dress code policy at Riverside Academy, and the transformation was remarkable. Not overnight, not perfect, but real and tangible in ways that mattered. It was a Friday afternoon in late spring, and the regional debate championship was being held in the large auditorium at the community college downtown. Teams from 15 schools across the region had competed throughout the day, and now it was down to the final round. Amara Williams stood at the podium representing Riverside Academy, her braids pulled back into an elegant updo, golden and amber beads catching the stage lights. The debate topic was criminal justice reform, and Amara was in her element. She spoke with the confidence and articulation of someone far beyond her 14 years, citing statistics, making logical arguments, anticipating counterpoints, and delivering her closing statement with a passion that left the audience mesmerized. When the judges announced Riverside Academy as the regional champions, when they called Amara's name as the top individual speaker, the Riverside section of the audience erupted in cheers. And there, in the third row, standing and applauding with genuine enthusiasm, was Mrs. Patricia Thornton. The teacher's face was radiant with pride as she watched her student accept the trophy, as she saw Amara shake hands with the judges, as the young girl she had once tried to diminish now stood on that stage shining with accomplishment. It was a moment of profound redemption, not because it erased what had happened, but because it showed what was possible when a student was allowed to be fully herself. Next to Mrs. Thornton sat Maya, screaming and cheering, and next to Maya was grandmother Ao, tears of joy streaming down her face, holding her phone up to record every moment. The changes at Riverside Academy weren't limited to Amara's success. Walking through the hallways of the school now felt different. Students wore their cultural identity with pride and without fear. There was a Somali girl named Aisha who wore her hijab in beautiful colors and patterns. There was a group of black students, boys and girls, sporting natural hairstyles, afros picked out to magnificent heights, locks adorned with beads and shells, twist-outs and braids in intricate patterns. There was a Mexican-American student named Carlos who wore traditional embroidered shirts on cultural heritage days. The school had become a tapestry of diversity, and it was beautiful. The diversity committee that had been formed as part of the policy revision was active and influential. It included students, teachers, parents, and community members, and they met monthly to review policies, address concerns, and plan cultural education initiatives. Student voices were not just heard now, they were actively solicited and valued. When decisions were being made about curriculum, about school events, about policies that affected student life, there were students at the table contributing to those conversations. Marcus Chin, the student body president who had stood up and supported the petition when it mattered, had become a key liaison between the student body and the administration. In early May, Marcus organized a cultural celebration assembly, the first of what would become an annual tradition at Riverside Academy. The gymnasium was decorated with flags from countries around the world. There were performances, a traditional Indian dance, a spoken word piece about the immigrant experience, a mariachi band, a step team from the Black Student Union. There were tables with food from different cultures, displays of traditional clothing, presentations about various heritage celebrations. And one of the most moving moments of the assembly came when Mrs. Patricia Thornton took the stage. She walked to the microphone wearing a simple dress, her hands holding a piece of paper that trembled slightly. "I've been asked to participate in today's celebration," she said, her voice carrying through the gymnasium, "and I'm honored to do so. I'd like to read a poem by Maya Angelou, one of the greatest American poets, a Black woman whose words have touched millions." She cleared her throat and began to read "Still I Rise," and as her voice carried Angelou's powerful words about resilience, about refusing to be broken, about rising despite oppression, there wasn't a sound in that gymnasium. Students sat transfixed, some mouthing the words along with her, others wiping tears from their eyes. When she finished, when she read the final lines, "I rise, I rise, I rise," the gymnasium erupted in applause. It was a moment of profound symbolism. Mrs. Thornton, who had tried to suppress cultural expression, now stood before the school celebrating it, honoring it, giving voice to it. The change wasn't instant. There were still moments of tension, still conversations that needed to be had, still work to be done. But the trajectory was clear. Riverside Academy was becoming the kind of place where all students could thrive as their authentic selves. Time moved forward as it always does, and suddenly 2 years had passed. It was June, graduation day for the 8th grade class at Riverside Academy. The middle school graduation ceremony was held outside on the athletic field, white folding chairs arranged in neat rows, a temporary stage set up with a podium decorated with the school colors. Families filled the audience, cameras ready, proud smiles on their faces. And among the graduating students, one name was called first, not in alphabetical order, but in honor of achievement: Amara Williams, valedictorian. Amara walked to the podium in her graduation gown, her braids now styled in a crown around her head, intricate and beautiful, adorned with beads that represented 2 years of growth, struggle, and triumph. At 16 years old now, she carried herself with a maturity and confidence that was inspiring to witness. She adjusted the microphone, looked out at her classmates, at the families in the audience, at the teachers sitting in the front rows, and she began her speech. "2 years ago," Amara said, her voice clear and strong, "I learned one of the most important lessons of my life, and I didn't learn it in a classroom. I learned it standing in front of a mirror, looking at my braids, deciding whether to remove them to avoid conflict or to keep them to honor who I am." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. The theme of my speech today is the power of standing in your truth. Because that's what I had to do, and that's what each of you will have to do as you move forward into the next chapter of your lives. Amara didn't name Mrs. Thornton directly, but everyone knew what she was referencing. "I faced a challenge that asked me to choose between being accepted and being myself. I was told that parts of my identity were inappropriate, that my cultural expression was a distraction, that to belong, I needed to change." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And I learned that sometimes the hardest battles we face teach us the most important lessons. I learned that change happens when we refuse to make ourselves smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for us. Instead, we must demand that those spaces expand to include us." She spoke about courage, about the importance of allies, about the power of community. She spoke about how change is uncomfortable, how growth requires us to confront our biases and our fears. "To my fellow graduates," she said, her voice growing more passionate, "you are inheriting a world that desperately needs people who are willing to stand in their truth. Don't let anyone convince you that being yourself is too much, too loud, too different. Your difference is your strength. Your authenticity is your power. In the audience, Mrs. Thornton sat with tears quietly streaming down her face, but they were tears of pride, of genuine joy for this remarkable young woman she'd once tried to diminish. Next to the teacher section, Grandmother Ao sat beaming, dressed in beautiful traditional Nigerian attire, holding a framed photograph of Amara's mother so that she could be part of this moment too. Amara's voice rose with emotion as she reached her conclusion. To everyone who supported me through my journey, thank you. You lifted me up when I was ready to fall. You stood beside me when it would have been easier to walk away. You believed in me when I struggled to believe in myself. Then she said something that made several people in the audience catch their breath. And to those who challenged me, even when it hurt, even when it felt unbearable, you helped me find my voice. You forced me to articulate who I am and why it matters. You taught me that my worth is not determined by other people's comfort with my existence. She paused, and her eyes briefly found Mrs. Thornton in the audience. There was no anger there anymore, just acknowledgement, just truth. Sometimes our greatest teachers are the ones who challenge us to stand up, speak out, and refuse to be erased. Amara concluded with words that would stay with her classmates long after that day. Class of 2028, we are the generation that will inherit and shape the future. Let's make it a future where everyone belongs, where every voice is heard, where every identity is celebrated. Let's make it a future where no child has to choose between being themselves and being accepted, because acceptance comes from embracing the fullness of who we are. The applause was thunderous. Students stood, families cheered, and Amara walked off that stage knowing she had spoken her truth and it had been heard. After the ceremony, after the caps had been thrown in the air, after countless photos had been taken, Amara stood with her grandmother accepting congratulations from friends and family. She saw Mrs. Thornton approaching through the crowd, and for a moment they just looked at each other. 2 years of history passed between them in that glance. The pain, the fight, the slow journey toward understanding. Amara, Mrs. Thornton said quietly, might I have a moment? Amara nodded, and they stepped slightly away from the crowd. That was a remarkable speech, Mrs. Thornton said, her voice thick with emotion. You are a remarkable young woman. Amara smiled softly. Thank you, Mrs. Thornton. The teacher took a breath, choosing her words carefully. I meant what I said months ago. I'm so deeply sorry for what I put you through. And watching you today, seeing the person you've become, the leader you are, you're going to change the world, Amara. Amara looked at this woman who had once been her adversary, who had become something else over these 2 years, not quite a friend but not an enemy either. Someone who represented the possibility of growth, of change, of redemption through action rather than just words. We all can, Mrs. Thornton, Amara said, her voice gentle but firm. We all can change the world if we're willing to do the hard work of examining ourselves, acknowledging our mistakes and committing to do better. She extended her hand and Mrs. Thornton took it. They shook hands and it wasn't a Hollywood moment of complete forgiveness and reconciliation. It was something more real than that. It was acknowledgement. It was respect. It was the recognition that both of them had been changed by what had happened, and that change, while painful, had led to growth. What Amara and Mrs. Thornton didn't fully realize in that moment was how far the ripples of their story had spread. In the months and years following the Riverside Academy policy change, other schools across the state and then across the country had begun examining their own dress code policies. The petition that Maya had started, that had grown to thousands of signatures, had caught the attention of education policy organizations. The story of Amara Williams, the 14-year-old girl who stood up for her right to wear her cultural hairstyle, had become a catalyst for a broader movement. School districts in California, New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts passed legislation explicitly protecting students' rights to wear natural hairstyles. The Crown Act, which stood for creating a respectful and open world for natural hair, gained momentum in state legislatures across the country. Students who had felt alone in their experiences of discrimination began sharing their stories, using hashtags like #LetAmaraLearn and #MyHairMyHeritage and #ProtectBlackHair. The movement grew beyond just hair. It became about the right of all students to express their cultural and religious identity without fear of punishment or discrimination. News outlets did follow-up stories, checking in on Riverside Academy, on Amara, on the changes that had taken place. They interviewed students who talked about feeling seen and valued for the first time. They spoke with parents who were grateful their children could attend school without having to choose between their heritage and their education. And yes, they interviewed Mrs. Thornton too, who spoke openly about her journey, about confronting her biases, about the ongoing work of becoming a better educator. Her honesty, her willingness to be vulnerable about her mistakes, helped other educators recognize their own biases and commit to change. At home that evening after graduation, Amara sat in the same living room where her grandmother had braided her hair 2 years ago on that fateful morning. Ao sat behind her now, as she had countless times before, her skilled fingers working through Amara's hair, maintaining the braids, replacing beads that had worn out, adding new ones. It was a ritual that connected them across time and space to all the women who had come before them. On the wall hung a photograph that Ao had created, for generations of women. Great-grandmother in Nigeria, her hair in traditional braids. Grandmother Ao as a young woman, her hair styled in elaborate patterns. Amara's mother, smiling with her own beautiful braids. And Amara, at 14, her braids adorned with the golden and amber beads that had started it all. "What are you thinking about, my dear?" Ao asked softly, her fingers gentle in Amara's hair. Amara was quiet for a moment before speaking. "I'm thinking about how this all started. How scared I was that first morning going back to school with my braids. How I almost gave in, almost removed them just to avoid the conflict." Ao's hands paused in her work. "But you didn't." Amara shook her head slightly. "No, I didn't. Because you taught me that my hair is not a distraction. It's my history. It's my pride. It's my freedom." Amara's voice took on a quality that was almost meditative, reflective. "I used to think that wearing my braids was just about me, about my personal choice, about honoring Mom's memory. But now I understand it's so much bigger than that. Every time I walk into a room with my head high and my braids adorned, I'm making a statement. I belong here exactly as I am. And every other girl who looks like me, who wears her hair like me, she sees that and knows she belongs too." Ao smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Amara. Not just because you stood up for yourself, but because you stood up for everyone who comes after you." The months turned into years, and suddenly it was Amara's first day of high school. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror on that late August morning, now 16 years old, looking at herself in her new school uniform. Her braids were styled differently now, a bit more sophisticated, still adorned with beads but arranged in an elegant pattern that fell down her back. She adjusted her backpack, took a deep breath, and smiled at her reflection. There was no fear in that smile. There was confidence. There was pride. There was the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly who she was and refused to apologize for it. As Amara walked toward the front door, Ao called out from the kitchen. "First day of high school, my dear. Are you ready?" Amara turned back and grinned. "I'm ready, Grandma. I'm so ready." She walked out of her house, her braids swaying with each confident step, the beads creating that familiar musical clicking sound that had become the soundtrack of her journey. She walked through her neighborhood, past houses where other families were sending their children off to school, past the park where she used to play as a little girl, toward the bus stop where she'd catch her ride to the high school across town. As she walked, a voice seemed to accompany her, her own voice, speaking words that had become her truth. "My hair is not a distraction. It's my history, carrying the stories of generations of strong African women who wore their braids as acts of resistance and survival. It's my pride, a daily affirmation that I am beautiful exactly as I am, that my culture is valuable, that my identity matters. It's my freedom, the physical manifestation of my right to exist in the world as my authentic self, without apology, without shame, without compromise." Amara arrived at the high school, a much larger building than Riverside Academy, filled with students she didn't know, teachers whose names she hadn't learned yet, a whole new chapter of her educational journey. She paused at the entrance, took a deep breath, and then walked through those doors with her head held high, her braids adorned with golden and amber beads catching the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Students turned to look at her as she passed, and she met their gazes with a calm, confident smile. She belonged here. She knew that now. Not because anyone had given her permission, but because she had claimed that right for herself. As Amara disappeared into the crowded hallway, heading toward her first class, toward her future, toward all the possibilities that lay ahead of her, words appeared, a message for everyone watching this story unfold. Cultural hairstyles are now protected in many schools across the country, but discrimination still exists. Students of color, particularly black girls, continue to face punishment for wearing their natural hair. The fight for full acceptance and equality is ongoing. Another message appeared: stand up for your right to be yourself. Challenge unjust policies. Support those who face discrimination. Real change happens when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice. And then, one final message: Amara's story is fictional, but it represents the real experiences of thousands of students across the country. Their voices matter. Their identities matter. Their right to be themselves matters. The camera followed Amara from behind as she walked down that high school hallway, her braids swaying, her head high, her stride confident. And then, just before she turned a corner and disappeared from view, she stopped. She turned around and looked directly back, as if looking at everyone who had followed her journey. She smiled, a brilliant, genuine smile full of hope and strength and unshakable certainty. And then she turned and walked forward into her future, into a world that she had helped change, into a life lived on her own terms as her authentic self without apology. The screen faded to black, but the impact of her story remained, a reminder that courage doesn't always look like grand gestures or dramatic moments. Sometimes courage looks like a 14-year-old girl deciding that her identity matters more than other people's comfort. Sometimes courage looks like refusing to make yourself smaller. Sometimes courage looks like standing in your truth even when the whole world seems to be telling you to sit down. And sometimes, that's exactly the kind of courage that changes everything. If this story moved you, if Amara's journey inspired you, if you believe that every young person deserves the right to be themselves without fear or shame, then subscribe right now because stories like this matter and your support helps us continue sharing them. And here's my final question for you. What part of your identity have you ever been asked to hide or minimize, and did you comply or resist? Your answer matters because every story of resistance, every moment of standing in your truth, adds to the collective courage that changes our world. Share it in the comments below.